From the back cover. Sentimental Doubts, here translated into English for the first time by Jessica Sequeira, was iconic Chilean writer Teresa Wilms Montt's first book. It was originally published in 1917 in Buenos Aires, after the author had left an entire life behind her in Santiago: her husband, her parents, the convent where she'd been confined for supposedly committing adultery, and her 2 daughters, whom she was forbidden from seeing. In this work, she communicates her inquietudes, the racing heart, the muttering mind, the explosion of doubts. From Snuggly Books. Good evening. Welcome back. My name is Derek Main, and this is Read the World, where I review translated literature. But not typically poetry. This is my first translated poetry review. And this is prose poetry, so I'm a little more comfortable, a little more in my element and in my zone. But the reason that I don't typically review poetry is I don't read it much. And I know that kind of speaks poorly on me. But I've always appreciated and loved the form and the conciseness of language, the ability to really stab at something quickly, sometimes with beautiful poetry sort of effortlessly or seemingly effortlessly. But I'm not much into the flowery, descriptive language, or language that is, while beautiful and very imagery heavy and focused, it's just doesn't truly draw me in. And while because this is poetry, there is not a lot, but there is some of that imagery in today's work. But this is much more raw, and it really gets at the thematic quality of the best translated work and literature in general that I love. So that's why poetry. And this is my copy of Teresa Wilms Montt, Sentimental Doubts, translated by Jessica Sequeira, and this is from Snuggly Books. I want to take a minute because it's very interesting to talk about the translation. If you've gotten to this stage, you've already heard the biography of Teresa Wilms Montt and why this writer is still so fascinating so many years later. But the translator actually has her own work, original work, A Luminous History of the Palm, that she wrote. It is from Sublunary Press, and it is a beautiful edition that I have purposely not cracked open. Now, obviously, I won't review it on this channel as it's not translated, but I associate the palm with summer, and so on the first day of summer, I'm going to open up, and hopefully it will be nice and beautiful outside, and I will sit underneath my own trees, which are, I believe, oak and cedar, and read A Luminous History of the Palm. So this is how the writer, well, the translator in this case, writer, first came to my attention. Sublunary Press is a press that I like very much. I watched a reading of hers in anticipation of that coming out and really liked what I heard and so ordered that. Well, so then I find out about this work that she's translated, and this very sort of forgotten but strangely wonderful Chilean author. And the beginning of this work, before we get into the prose poetry, actually has an introduction that serves kind of as a translator's note. And what I found really interesting was it's one of the best examples you will see of a translator really getting into the technical and artistic struggles, and not struggles in a negative way or sort of a difficult thing, but the work, getting into what the work is in frankly a very short introduction. But I loved this from page 10. So the title is Sentimental Doubts. However, it actually is Sentimental Inquietudes. But now the translator is going to explain why that choice was made. The word inquietudes is rare now, in plural or in singular, and to render it literally would suggest a preciousness that the raw original text does not have. Language reflects shifts in the priority that society gives to emotions. A similar decay in resonance has affected the word hysteria. After running through the options of concerns, too legalistic, anxieties, unpoetic, or restlessness, but this isn't really a plural noun in English, I settled on doubts, which in its instability seems to best capture Wilms Montt's tone. And I love that. I mean, for someone who devours translated work, to get that kind of insight on how you make a decision was really lovely. And now I'm going to read a bit, because first I want to tell you how I absorbed this. The reason we've got this little silly setup is this is what I did last night. I lit some candles, some incense, I smoked some weed, and I read this beautiful work in one sitting. And then I went back to the beginning of the verses and read it to myself out loud into the evening. It moved me so profoundly that I just want to share why. And the only way that I can share why is through her words and then a few comments that I have. But I want to really emphasize that this is but a sampling. I've picked 5 very quick things, most of them a line or 2, but this is a rich text. As I said, I read it in my head, as my young daughter says. I'll read in my head now if I'm bothering you, Dad. And then immediately went back to it and read aloud. So do not think that I am spoiling anything or would ruin your reading experience should you be so inspired. Verse 13, page 42. I'm even jealous of those beings who have no bread, but possess what all the riches in the world cannot give me. Someone who loves them, who listens with tenderness to their complaints about life and shares their amazement in rare moments of happiness. That is one of the loneliest but rawest sentiments you could find. Verse 21, page 54. All of us carry a twilight and a daybreak in our spirits. My spirit tends more to death than to life. It aspires more to sleep than to wakefulness. It leans towards the earth where it will find its bed. I mean, how beautiful is that language? And how do you feel? I felt very connected to that. I am tired, even in moments of wakefulness. My spirit, if we have to, does lean towards the earth. I feel fatalistic and morbid at times, a lot of times. And I thought that was a beautiful way to put that, in a way that made me not scared of it and able to accept it a little bit more as just part of me. And here's a Chilean woman over 100 years ago reaching out through a translator, through time, space, and the ether, to gently pat me on the back one evening in the midst of a global pandemic and say, it's okay. Verse 32, page 73. Does love really exist, or is it only a longing to reflect oneself in another being so as to better love oneself? You've heard and you know that saying, you have to love yourself before someone else will love you. So how about taking that a step further and asking a really difficult question of yourself, which is, does love, even when you do have it, I'm fortunate enough to have it in spades, does love exist? Or even more than needing to love yourself, it is just another form, another vehicle to love yourself by seeing yourself through someone else. Verse 34, page 78. And I live because it is cowardice to die, and I hide my sobbing because the century doesn't understand this hysterical sentimentality. I want to say two things about that briefly, and then I'm going to end this review with one complete verse, although a short one, and no commentary. So, this is a depressing piece of literature, but playful at times, and not devoid of hope, but not the sort of hope that we've become accustomed to. Not hope that things will change, or that circumstances will change, or that she will change. More of a hope that the change will be an acceptance. The change will be a settling down of those doubts and of those inquietudes, if you can say them aloud, if you can put them to paper, if you can whisper them to a friend. Would this momentarily ease the grip? That's where the hope lies. I really appreciated that in something so dark, she said why she lives. Because it is cowardice to die. That's the first thing I wanted to say about that part. And the second was, I hide my sobbing because the century doesn't understand this hysterical sentimentality. And we are now in a new century and well into it. I don't think this century understands hysterical sentimentality either. We're testing it, right? As are many folks in a share culture and time. But hysteric sentimentality, I believe, what a beautiful way to say the century. And she does not say this century, she says the century. And so I imagine that, well, I like to imagine that this was written just yesterday when I first read it. As hysterically sentimental as that is. Verse 42, page 91. This is the entirety of verse 42. If the planet were to fall silent and stop whirling through the reaches above, the strength of my pain would make it revive, as a dead lake would revive if a river flowed into it. Thanks for watching. Be good to folks.